You are listening to The Artist in American History by Dr. Darren R. Reed. If you are listening to this podcast, please note that this is a special video presentation.
Up in the sky, look!
It's a bird!
It's a plane! It's Superman!
When Superman made his debut in Action Comics #1 in 1938, one of the villains the Man of Steel had to deal with was a warmonger who was attempting to maneuver America into the escalating conflict that was then stirring in Europe. According to Superman's debut appearance, American involvement in the growing situation across the Atlantic was something to be avoided, perhaps at all costs. And so it was that Superman's first adventure saw him reinforcing the idea of American isolationism, whilst dismissing America's potential role in foreign conflict. How times have changed.
Disguised as a mild-mannered newspaper reporter, Clark Kent.
When Action Comics #1 was released, American intervention in external conflicts was far from a given. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's iconic creation stood for justice, sure, but not for warfare. In that context, then, this short animated film from 1942, and the direct attention which it pays to the Pacific theatre of the Second World War, should start to come into focus. Like the comic book series which it paralleled, the cinematic Superman cartoons of the 1940s engaged with the war, but few of them did so as directly as this stunningly animated film, which saw Clark Kent and Lois Lane reporting on the conflict from behind enemy lines.
Well, say, who could sleep for a racket like this?
But it's been going on every night since we've been interned. What do you suppose it could be?
Could be sabotage, I hope.
Me too. But who? Clark, do you suppose...
Yes, Lois?
Oh, nothing. Just a silly hunch that maybe Superman might be over here.
Quiet! Do not talk!
As we can see from this image, and hear from the music playing in this scene, filmmakers were quick to use stereotype signals to communicate certain ideas to their audience. The small eyes and large glasses were a common motif depicted during this era in order to mock the Japanese. The glasses, which were often oversized, drew attention to the tiny rendering of the eyes, itself a racialized characteristic, used to differentiate and alienate the US from the Far East. The image now appearing on screen is an example of World War II era propaganda posters made in the United States. Note the tiny eyes and oversized glasses, the exaggerated mouth, and general sense of menace which the artist has attempted to convey, and compare it to some of the other images seen in this film. Consider it not only in the context of other Japanese characters, but in the context of Clark Kent and Lois Lane, who have been depicted in a stylized but recognisably beautiful fashion. The Japanese characters who are seen in close-up tend to look ridiculous by comparison, combining menace on the one hand with clownish, dehumanising looks upon the other. A seemingly natural conclusion that many viewers of this material might draw is that the racial imagery depicted herein might be completely explained, perhaps even excused, by the wartime context in which it appeared. It could be argued that as this film was produced during the Second World War, that we should expect to encounter such highly racialised imagery, that during wartime, particularly wars in the mid-20th century, that the appearance of racism in pop culture artefacts such as this is to be expected. The problem with such an idea is that it ignores decades of prior anti-Asian racism and propaganda in the United States. The image now appearing on screen was produced in 1899 and is entitled The Yellow Terror. This image is a fairly typical example of the type of anti-Asian imagery which appeared throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries. In order to understand the racial imagery in this film, we must remember that white America had a very difficult relationship with immigrants from China and other parts of Asia. Large numbers emigrated to the United States in the 1800s and were found particularly in the western part of the country, where they were employed as cheap labour and used to construct such grand enterprises as the country's growing network of railroads. In spite of this contribution to the development of the US, Chinese and Asian immigrants were often hated by their white counterparts, who unleashed physical and cultural violence against them. The image now appearing on screen appeared in 1882, alongside the Chinese Exclusion Act, which explicitly barred Chinese labourers from entering the United States. What's interesting about this image is that it challenges the exclusion of Asian immigrants even as it draws upon stereotyped imagery to make its point. It is worth remembering that artists, writers, and filmmakers could make significant challenges to the racial norm of the time in which they lived, and that we should never expect the artistry of a period to be defined completely by dominant racial or racist attitudes. Indeed, the creative realm is one of the best places to challenge bias and bigotry. Take the Superman radio show from 1946. In the story entitled The Clan of the Fiery Cross, Superman takes on a fictionalised version of the KKK, whose main targets were Asian Americans. Not only did the Clan of the Fiery Cross spit in the proverbial eye of anti-Asian racism and of the KKK, it was a ratings hit, and that should be remembered before one assumes that the mid-20th century was a time when racism went unchallenged, that we should expect it and therefore not pass comment upon it when it appears. The type of racial imagery that appeared in this Superman film was shaped and informed by World War II, sure, but anti-Asian racism had a long history in the United States which predated and outlived that relatively brief episode. World War II might have sharpened anti-Asian racism in the United States, but it certainly didn't create it, because it was almost a century old by the time that war broke out, and it would continue to last long after that war had concluded. Many of the anti-Asian images deployed in this film are typical not of the wartime era, but of the United States throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries. Big teeth and small eyes had been used with malicious intent for decades, but they had also been challenged in film, literature, and illustration. Consider Charlie Chaplin's final speech from his seminal 1940 film, The Great Dictator. In that spectacular scene, we see Chaplin tell his audience that, and I quote, "I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world there is room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way." End quote. The artist in American history has been responsible for challenging and reinforcing notions about race. Chaplin famously challenged them. But the spectacularly expensive cinematic Superman cartoons of the 1940s reinforced them, joining a long tradition which predated the Second World War by decades.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Artist in American History. For more lectures and documentaries, please visit darrenreedhistory.co.uk or follow along on Twitter at the handle @thathistorian.